Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about the evidence for boundaries of prehistoric land units following the high ground, the watersheds or interfluves between valleys, and how that evidence is less in the landscape itself than in a group of words we still use more or less daily. This group of words with a common ancestor includes the modern English words kin and canal, canine and queen. Now, before I risk engulfing you in linguistics, allow me to approach this topic with a little bit of narrative. Apologies in advance for what may well be wonky pronunciation of Irish names and words. One of the most splendid tales from the medieval Irish literature tells of how King Eachid attempts to find a worthy successor between his 4 sons. After an inconclusive first round, brothers are sent out again, one after another, on a hunting expedition. On their route they encounter a well guarded by a hideous old woman who says they can only have water if they kiss her first. First 2 brothers flatly refuse and are compelled to return back before they can complete the hunt. The 3rd brother gives her a peck on the cheek and is rewarded with a dipper full of water and the rather enigmatic promise of a touch of Tara. The 4th brother, who is known in later legends as Neil of the 9 Hostages, is less coy. He lays with a hag. The Irish word banai is a euphemism along the lines of later biblical translations of Genesis, which read, "And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived." The hag transforms into a beautiful woman and reveals herself to be the sovereignty of Ireland, known as Flaith Erin. She grants Neil not only all the water he needs, but also the kingship for many generations. Indeed, 26 of his descendants will be the High Kings of Ireland. The 3rd brother, who pecked her on the cheek, is granted a minor royal title. Now, such loathly ladies are a common character in tales told throughout the world. In Ireland, a variant of this story involves the earlier Irish High King, Lucath Lloyd. In late 14th century England, the same motif appears in John Gower's poem called Confessio ad Mantis, and also in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Wife of Bath's Tale. Indeed, the eponymous wife declares that the achievement of the sovereignty, although rarely attained by woman, is something which all women desire. The anonymous wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnall, written in the early 15th century, tells the same legend previously recounted by Chaucer. And in an entirely different Irish legend, King Con of the 100 Battles visits an otherworldly house. There he's given food and drink by a woman who identifies herself as Flaith Erin, or sovereignty. She asks in turn, "To whom shall be given this cup with the red drink?" The Irish for red drink is Derg Flaith. This is a play on words, as Laith means both drink and sovereignty, and indeed both words ultimately may have a common origin. Derg Flaith, the red drink, refers to the mead used in the banais, or sacred marriage of royal inauguration. Mead is a word found throughout Indo-European languages and means both honey drink and ritual beverage. By association, it is the drink of libations and sacrifices. The same word is the origin of the legendary Irish Queen Maeve. Her name means the one who intoxicates. Queen Maeve appears many times in one of the cycles of legends associated with the Connaught lineage, or the phased Cruach Hen. She has a reputation for seducing young heroes, even boasting to her husband that "I never had one man without another waiting in his shadow." However, we should think of these legends as the later elaboration of a tutelary goddess of the phased Cruach. Maeve had her counterparts in other regions of Ireland, although less information has come down to us. The Boyne Valley retains the name of its tutelary goddess, Boyne, and the River Shannon also seems to preserve the memory of a Shannon. Ulster's Royal Centre, Emain Macha, is named after the tutelary deity of the face Emma, a goddess associated with horses. In both Scotland and Wales there are rivers called Dee, which are said to be named after a tutelary goddess, and the Scottish one retained some of these associations until the mid-20th century, at least for the Scottish travellers, who still maintain deep ancestral links with that area. Between Wales and England is the River Severn, probably derived from Sabrina, although perhaps before that after a female deity called Hafren. Such tutelary goddesses are not merely river deities. They would once have been the guardians not only of the water, but also the valleys through which the river wound its course. And certainly the most sacred places would have been the various natural springs, which fed into the various tributaries of the main watercourse. To understand sovereignty, we need to think of where someone lives, their place of birth within that landscape, and their kinship to other family members as all intimately woven together. And the clue is in kinship. Kin are our blood relatives. The Old English word kin has the meaning of either the family or the race of people we identify with. And the word kin has a number of surprising linguistic relatives, all from the Proto-Indo-European root word gene, meaning to give birth to and to procreate. I've no idea what you already know about how languages evolve and the significance of what linguists call Proto-Indo-European. It's a language, or more likely a small group of languages, spoken around 4,000 years ago, and which evolve into nearly all European languages. The exceptions are Hungarian, Finnish and Basque, and also evolves into all the Sanskritic languages of India, hence Proto-Indo-European. I'm not a linguist, and the internet can provide summaries of all matters relating to how Proto-Indo-European scholarship has evolved over the decades. And it has evolved. Ideas about Proto-Indo-European written early in the 20th century are likely to be way different from more recent scholarship. So the key point is that words that now seem to be distinct can be shown to have an origin in what are known as Proto-Indo-European root words. So kin is related, excuse the pun, to such word as the Old English kennen, meaning to beget, to create, and that is close to the Scottish dialect word ken, which has the sense to know. It's related to kith, as in the sense of native country or home. It sort of borrows the sense of the place you ken or know. It's also related to the word kind, as in one of a kind. It's also related to the German word kind, as in the English word child, or English word kindergarten. It's related to genus, before the sense of biological classification arose up early in the 17th century. The Latin and Greek origins of this word denoted race, stock, kind, family, birth, descent, origin, offspring. And in other Proto-Indo-European derived languages, the primary meaning is also to beget, to give birth, origin. The same word is related to genes and genetics, and it is also related to the genie, as in genie loci, which has the sense of spirit of place, but really means the spirits of the dead, more accurately, the spirits of the ancestral dead, the spirits of one's ancestors. Meaning sort of shift, but the origin is there. Same root word also gives us the Greek word gyne, which in Greek means woman, but it gives us modern English words such as gynecology. It's also the root word of the Latin cunus, which has the sense of vulva, the Old English word queen, the Middle English word quim, and yes, the modern English word which I can't use on YouTube, but speaking euphemistically, can be found in the midst of Scunthorpe. Also, it's the same root word for cunei, meaning a wedge, and if you think of cuneiform writing, it's a series of characters, letters made up from wedge shapes. Also, the origin of canine, and kennels, and here the link is the wedge shape or cunei shape of a dog's canine teeth. It's a bit terribly tautological, but etymology can be like that. It's also the origin of the word canal, in the original sense of ditches, nothing to do with things that you take narrowboats along, and the word channels. I'll come back to why we think canals and channels are quite a big clue, actually, to what I'm talking about. So, the sense of kin is originally close to another English word, beget. They sound different now, but the Old English words kin and kennen, meaning kin and beget, sound almost the same. And deliberately using what was already an anachronism, the King James's translation of the Bible tells us that Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren, and indeed a number of other lineages linked by the same word, begat. These biblical accounts read as if only the men mattered to family history. Clearly that is not the case, and Isaac's mother also begat Isaac, just as Isaac's wife begat Jacob, not to mention any sisters Jacob might have had, who might otherwise remain outside this account. The matriarchal line of descent matters at least as much as patriarchal lineage, and despite the patriarchal wording of the Old Testament, maternal bloodlines were and are important in Judaism. To this day, one can only be Jewish if your mother is Jewish. You can convert, but that's not you're not born Jewish unless your mother is Jewish. And a similar belief is shared by many traditional cultures around the world, including the Hopi in the New World. What about canines, specifically in the sense of dogs? By the Neolithic, dogs have been man's best friend for over 5,000 years. Seems a fireside hound was a must-have companion in the early Neolithic ideas of home. Now, dogs are scavengers, and later myths would see them as otherworldly psychopomps, assisting the spirits of the dead to their final abode. Indeed, in cultures where excarnation was commonplace, such as the Neolithic, scavenging dogs may have been observed all too clearly, transforming a corpse. In Welsh myth and lore, the Hounds of Annwn, Cwn Annwn, were the spectral hounds of the otherworldly paradise, known as Annwn. The same hounds are also referred to in Welsh folklore as Cwn Mamau, the hounds of the mothers. And to refer to Mamau is, in modern Welsh, the counterpart to referring to the wee folk of Irish lore and the fairies of English traditions. And as the Latin expression Dea Matronae clearly states, local guardians were thought of as sacred mothers. Also derived from the same Proto-Indo-European root word is modern English queen. The root word originally had the sense of woman or wife, perhaps honoured woman. By definition, queens are married to kings, and an Anglo-Saxon queen, known as a quen, was married to a kinning, which is the same sense of king and ruler, although the literal sense of the word kinning is the followers of a family or race, as it's kin followed by ing, a contraction of ingus, followers. Now, kings are thought of as leaders, not followers, so clearly the ingus component must be interpreted more broadly, with the suggestion that the king is descended from noble birth. In other words, he is a follower of the bloodline, with the strong implication that the bloodline is a mother-daughter one. Perhaps, maybe I'm stepping where more angelic folk fear to tread, the concept of kingship goes back before male-dominated majesty. Should we not be looking at the word king, but instead at the word which denotes an elite, honoured as much for being sacred as their regalness, and much less gender-specific? Could the word be closer to the modern sense of sovereignty, especially the way sovereignty can be used to denote close association with a country, or, in recent centuries, an empire? Let's go back. Why do canals, channels and ditches feature in this list? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's a most insightful question. Is it because channels are wedge-shaped in section? Well, yeah, that may be part of it. Or is it because such small watercourses run off from natural springs, the sort of wells guarded by the loathly ladies? If such water sources were associated with female protective spirits or deities, then such a channel could quite reasonably be referred to by a word that alluded to the part of the anatomy where women urinate. Or there may have been an association with giving birth, a sense of the goddess sharing her creative powers to produce water on which the lives of people and animals living on the land depended. In medieval Irish lore, and that's L-A-W, not L-O-R-E, upstream was in some sense thought of as more senior or more noble. Might that be a long shadow once cast by the uppermost reaches of a watercourse being the most sacred? In an earlier video I discussed the mythological significance of upstream in more detail. Whatever, the sense of sovereignty certainly spans springs, the channels taking the water away, rivers, valleys, and the people who live in the valley. Right, let's visit some especially interesting springs. Two spring-fed pools between Alton Barns and Alton Priors are the source of the Wiltshire Avon, which flows through the Neolithic Megahenge at Martyn and then past Stonehenge on its way to the Solent. Early spellings of the village name Alton reveal it originally meant at the wells. Alton is a few miles south of the Neolithic monuments in and around Avebury. Quite possibly this location has been regarded as especially significant since the Mesolithic, in a similar way that the spring at Blickmead has recently been revealed to be a gathering place long before Stonehenge was built, about a mile away. Closer to Avebury is Swallowhead Springs, located between the early Neolithic chamber tomb at West Kennet and the late Neolithic mound called Silbury Hill. Swallowhead Springs are regarded as the source of the River Kennet, which then flows due east to the confluence with the Thames at Reading. Lowering of the water table in recent decades means this spring now usually only flows in the late winter. The cathedral at Wells in Somerset was built to the west of the spring-fed pools which give the settlement its name. This photograph shows the east end of the cathedral reflected in the pool, where the spring water literally bubbles up. Now, there's something different about naming practices today than when river names were first created. These days, most rivers have one name from their estuary back to whichever tributary is furthest away. Other tributary rivers usually have consistent names from their source to the confluence with a larger river. But there's enough evidence from place names to suggest that this was not the case in Anglo-Saxon times, and tantalising evidence for this being the continuation of a pre-Roman naming convention. I'll focus on a few examples. In southwestern Wiltshire there's a group of villages sharing the name Deverell. For once this is not the surname of a Norman landowner. Instead, Deverell seems to have been the earlier name for what is now the River Wylye, specifically the part of the Wylye which flows from south to north. A little further downstream and the river changes direction to flow southeast. This stretch flows through the settlement of Wylye, so presumably this part of the river was known as the Wylye. In Old English, Wylye means tricky stream, so presumably prone to flooding. Further downstream the river flows towards Wilton, once the eponymous county town of Wiltshire, where it joins the Nadder just before the Nadder itself flows into the Wiltshire Avon. In a somewhat similar manner, the upper reaches of the River Kennet flow southwards and are known to this day as the Winterbourne. Only when the watercourse turns sharply east at Swallowhead Springs does it become the Kennet. And while I might be stretching the evidence exceedingly thin, I think this earlier naming practice would have arisen from different stretches of a longer river having their own kin group and tutelary queen or goddess. It may well be that an entire river was associated with one kin group initially, but increasing population and the likelihood of family rifts may have resulted in larger kin groups fragmenting into smaller kin groups, but still sharing the same overall valley. I am really just guessing. The actual situation is probably going to be even more complex. What almost certainly would have been more complex than modern-day concepts is the attributes of the valley queens, the female deities personifying sovereignty. They would have been thought of as protective deities for both the land and the people and the animals who dwelt there. However, books like Robert Graves' The White Goddess have created a modern mentality which thinks of female deities in a woefully simplistic manner. To add to the problem, about 40 years ago, the misleading notion of a pan-Neolithic goddess was created. Please strip away these misconceptions. Our language is actually telling us that there were once many goddesses, each specific to one valley. Ethnographic parallels would suggest that these powerful female entities provided something akin to charisma, or a gift, as in the expression, a gifted child. However, as Christianity took hold in Northern Europe and the British Isles, this notion of charismatic potency merged into the Sanctus Spiritus of the Holy Trinity, and was deemed to be the potentia or potency of Christ. The idea of a female deity who is at the same time a unitary great goddess, manifesting as multiple local tutelary guardians, is actually entirely consistent with Roman Catholic theology, which recognises both the one and only Blessed Virgin Mary, and simultaneously have manifestation as a great many local saints. Our Lady of Walsingham, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Lourdes, Our Lady of Willesden, and a great many more place-specific instances. This one and many outlook is also consistent with the customary practices of rural Hindus, where each village has its own Mata, or mother, or Devi, or goddess, who in her supreme power aspect is known as Shakti, or energy. But during the rites of veneration in each settlement, she is addressed as Mata, or Devi, but rarely as Shakti. Right, returning to watercourses. Clearly bigger rivers, with several tributaries, created more complex relationships between land protective deities and the occupants. However, at least within a designated stretch of watercourse, families lived their lives in a landscape which inextricably and intimately associated with that goddess or queen. Watercourses were rarely boundaries until the later Anglo-Saxon period. If you want a useful study of where and why rivers started being used as boundaries, look up a study published in 2014 by Hannah and Martyn Whittock. I'll include details in the comments below. And what about the higher ground between the valleys? These would almost always have been wooded, although not necessarily the dense woodland which is now commonplace, but the more open woodland created when livestock are grazing. These uplands would be home to wolves. They didn't go extinct in England until the Middle Ages. Equally unwelcome would be encounters with the intimidatingly large cattle known as aurochs, which lived wild in Britain until sometime in the Iron Age. There would also have been large droves of wild pigs, and wild male boar are quite capable of killing humans. Overall, the liminal uplands would have been much more wild and unsafe than the more domesticated domain of the valleys. Even into the 19th century, the concept of the wildwood was part of folk song and folk tales, perhaps more with the German Black Forest in mind than anything left in the British Isles after centuries of depredations, as woodland was felled for timber and fuel. The intertribal higher ground was where Bronze Age people, and often Anglo-Saxons, created burial mounds. They were sited so the mound stood out on the skyline when seen from the valley, although this means they are often a few hundred metres away from the true ridge. Clumps of beech trees on the skyline near Avebury are all associated with Bronze Age burial mounds, although, while they're on the skyline when seen from the valley, they are about 200 metres from the ridge, which is actually the ridgeway running along the skyline. The higher ground was also where prehistoric kin groups met for rituals. Most of the Neolithic henges are between the headwaters of valleys. Avebury, for example, is located between the Bristol Avon to the west, the Upper Thames to the north, and the Wiltshire Avon to the south. Back in 2007, Gordon Noble published a useful paper with many more examples of henges between headwaters. Details again in the description below. And one final thought. Living in valleys means that the horizon is always elevated. When the sun does break over the surrounding hills, it shines brightly. I have discussed the significance of ringed horizons at specific Neolithic and later ritual sites in an earlier video. In this video I've only offered part of the evidence for why valleys once had their own queens, their own kin group. In the description below I'll include a link to a web page with a longer account.